Hello and welcome to Obsessive Audio. Eric here. Hope everybody's doing good. Hope everybody had a good week. Hope everybody had a good Black Friday, Cyber Monday experience. Did you get anything cool? Put it in the comments below. We'd love to hear from you. Today we've got a brand new product which is on introductory offer right now. It is the Tai Chi Reverb from Reverb Foundry. And we're going to go through the whole plugin. We're going to give it a walkthrough, hear how it sounds, listen to some audio examples, and explore the controls. But before that, some background. Today's adventure takes us to the United Kingdom, where exists a company that I'm sure most of us have heard of, called Liquid Sonics. Liquid Sonics, of course, the proud purveyors of such reverb classics as Reverberate, Illusion, Cinematic Rooms, Lustrous Plates, and of course, Seventh Heaven. But did you know that the founder of Liquid Sonics also started a company called Reverb Foundry? Reverb Foundry has been around for a while now. They've released a few products, including HD Cart, which is a plug-in version of a very expensive Pinnacle add-on to the already very expensive Lexicon 480L hardware reverb. They also released a software controller for Bricasti M7 hardware, so if you're lucky enough to own a Bricasti, you might know about this already. Which brings us to our latest release from Reverb Foundry, Tai Chi. So we're going to do a walkthrough of Tai Chi with all of the controls and how to operate it. But before we do that, let's just listen to some of the factory presets that it comes with. Tai Chi's got a very elegant and modern interface. Let's look at the various sections and see what they do. These arrows, these chevrons, scroll through the different presets, so you can go back and forth with them. You can also click on the preset name. It brings a drop-down menu that has the factory presets, sorted by category. It has any user presets that you may have made. As you can see, I've made quite a few. And you can manage these presets by going down to Manage User Presets. You can save presets, load them. You can also click on View User Presets. That'll bring up the folder where all of your user presets are located. You can go in there, you can rename them, you can create subfolders, organize them, and when you close it and get back to the plugin, that will all be reflected in the drop-down menu. You notice here there's A and B. These are two slots capable of holding different presets. So right now I have the chambers in A. Let's say I went to B, and that has the golden room in it. And let's say I ended up liking the golden room better, but I wanted to move that over to A. You can do that down here with Copy Snapshot. it can copy B over to A. Now when I go over to A, the golden room is in there. And of course you can do the opposite. You can copy A to B. The settings button has a drop down with two items. First off is the interface. You can make the plugin larger or smaller. You can scale it 70% to 150%. Next is the preset settings. Without getting too far ahead of ourselves, this has to do with the way that the reflections behave up top here. You can have them go to the same course, follow what the reverb is doing in the course. You can not have them go to any course at all, or you can give them a low, medium, or high course setting that's independent of the reverb part. Reflection timing has to do with the pre-delay, whether you want pre-delay on the reflections or not. And reverb processing, in this case, is giving you the choice between true stereo or mono to stereo. And if you do only have a mono source, you might want to select that because it does save you some CPU. This plugin is also capable of surround sound, quad, 3-channel. It'll go up to 7.0.2 and 7.1.2. In whatever mode that you've selected for the reverb processing, you can lock that so it won't change as you go through different presets, and you can do that down here with the parameter lock. Next to that, this question mark button is for information. You can call up the splash screen that'll tell you which version of Tai Chi you're running. You can access the manual online, and you can turn on or off the interactive assistance. And these are tooltips, text boxes that show up when you hover over each control. It'll give you a brief description of what the controls do. So here you have a level meter, and you can set this level meter to read the input, the output, the reflections, or the reverb. Right under that, you've got a master section where you can mix between dry and wet. Reverb and reflection. All the way down, you're hearing only the reflections. All the way up, you're hearing only the reverb. Right at 12 o'clock, it's an equal mix, and of course you can blend any point in between. Here's a master gain output, which goes from -20 to +20 dB range. Now underneath each of these knobs, you'll see this little lock icon. That's a parameter lock. And what you could do is enable that. Enable any ones that you choose or not. And when they're enabled, what happens is that those parameters will be locked, even if you were to, say, select a different preset. Those parameters will stay the same. So if you have a particular reverb tail length that you love, or a pre-delay that has to be timed to the song, or you've got certain settings, filter settings, whatever, any settings that you want to keep, but you want to go exploring different presets, you can lock the things that are important to you, and they won't change as you go through the different presets. Now, if you right-click on any of the knobs, it'll bring up this menu, and you can unlock or lock the parameter that you're hovering over. You can clear all of the locks. And finally, on this menu, you can set the reflections all to lock. So if you set reflections that you like, you can lock them. Let's clear those. And if you've got a reverb that you really like, you can lock those. And let's clear them again. Now, a lot of the settings for the reverb reside in these tabs right here. There's the Master tab, the Advanced tab, Dynamics, Fidelity, and Equaliser. Master's split up into two sections, the reverb section and the reflections section. For reverb, you've got your reverb time, and this is your main reverb tail. You've got a pre-delay that you can apply, which can also be synchronized to the DAW tempo. And if you change the tempo in the DAW, this will change along with it. The width control is your basic MS-style stereo expander. It can go from straight-up mono to full, and up to 150% expansion. This will affect both the reverb tail and the reflections. Over here on the reflection side of things, you've got different algorithms to choose from for the reflections. You've got room, hall, church, garage, and stadium. After you choose the algorithm that you like, you can further change the pattern of the reflections with this knob here, the pattern knob. If you look down here, you'll see it says position 1, and then there's a letter A. The position refers to how close the source is to you in that room, in that environment. The lower the number, the closer it is to you. So position 1 would be the closest, position 2 would sound farther back, and 3 and so forth until you're in the back of the room at position 4. The letters correspond to how reflective the surfaces would be, with the lower letters being less reflective, more dampening. So in position 1A, that's going to be very close to you, but the reflections are going to be very dampened. Each successive reflection is going to get a lot duller and quieter. As you go to B, C, D, E, F, these reflections are going to maintain their brightness and volume throughout the pattern of the algorithm. The spacing knob has to do with the timing of the reflections. You can make it very tight, very timed, very close together in a short amount of time, all of the reflections hitting. If you pull the knob down all the way, as you increase the knob, the time difference between the reflections will get larger and larger, spread out more over time. And with some of these reflection algorithms, the big ones like the Stadium, the timing is such that if you increase that spacing, you're going to be getting rhythmic effects sounding like a delay. You have your high-end roll-off, which is a low-pass filter, where you can change the frequency and the slope, 6, 12, 18, or 24 dBs per octave. Now the Advanced tab is where your diffusion and density settings and also your coarse modulation settings live. You got the density section over here and the diffusion section here. For diffusion, you can affect either the reflections or the reverb by toggling this button right here. As you can see the tail lit up, this would be the reverb settings for diffusion, and this would be the reflection settings. And we'll get a bit into the way this sounds later on. Over here is the coarse. You can affect the amount of coarse, you can disable it. Mod rate, same thing, that's the speed of the modulation, which can also be set to static. I should mention that there are many modulators in this reverb, more so than in a lot of reverbs. They don't all modulate at exactly the same rate, but this is like a master clock for them to operate relative to each other. There are also wander modulators. And according to the manual, the wander modulator indicates how much a reverb tap can be randomly moved while it is fading through zero. Quite a technical control, but generally just be aware that larger wander times can make the reverb a little less smooth, but bring out more character. Up here you have a thick and coarse section, and this applies the glide to more of the modulators. It increases the proportion of modulators that are gliding, thickens the coarse. There are 3 coarse modes: enrich, which is generally the smoothest one in terms of pitch. It doesn't call as much tension out to itself. It just gives you a lovely, lush effect. Drift, in which you're going to start to hear the pitch change more and more, going slightly out of tune. And then the full-on detune mode, where you can really hear the pitch variations and things can get pretty wild. Next tab is the Dynamics tab. It's a built-in compressor with your typical compressor controls: threshold, ratio, knee, attack, release, trim, -20 to +20 decibels, and a gain reduction meter. You can choose to apply the compressor to the reverb only, leaving the reflections alone, or the wet, which means the reverb and the reflections. You've got 2 modes to choose from: duck and compress. Duck is great because it's that traditional ducking effect where it's reacting to the dry signal coming in. It's a trick that producers have used for years, and it's great to see this starting to be included in reverbs as a standard feature, and very glad that Tai Chi has it. Compress is just the straight up compressor that's going to react to the wet signal or just the reverb in terms of how you have it set, and it's going to hold the line at a steady level, which can also help clear things up by preventing the reverb from popping out too loud in sections where you don't want it too loud. Next tab is the Fidelity tab, and this is where we get into the cool bit crushing effects. There's an input bandwidth filter, which simulates the anti-aliasing filters that were on the early digital reverb units. That can go down quite a bit, 4 kilohertz, taking out a lot of top end. It's a characteristic sound. You've got bit crushers on multiple different stages. The output stage, you can bit crush just the reverb, or you can bit crush the reflections. Recirculation has to do with applying effects within the internal feedback loops. So you can actually bit crush inside of that loop, so every time that reverb iterates around, it's getting more and more crushed, and that would be the resolution control here. You can actually get it to the point where it just fizzes out, almost sounds gated in a way. The depth control I found to be really subtle, but the manual says that high depth values will increase late stage modulation of the reverb paths for livelier sound. So presumably as you decrease it, you'll get a less lively, possibly more characteristic sound, and it can be set to static. And finally, the Equaliser tab, you've got a low-cut filter here with your different slopes to choose from and a cutoff frequency, low shelf frequency and gain, high shelf frequency and gain, and a high roll-off with the slopes and the cutoff frequency. You turn the EQ on off in here with the Enable EQ button. Now we get to multiband reverb time multipliers. You can select off, and if you don't need it, you should turn it off because it does use up quite a bit of CPU. Or you can set it to 3-band or 4-band. And this is a basic multiband setup where you can control the cutoffs and the reverb multipliers. And you can do that from the graphical interface, or you can also do it with the sliders. And what this does is it increases the reverb time for the frequencies in this band by a certain amount, by a certain multiplier. You can go up to 5 times. So let's say you have your reverb at 1 second. You can have the bass portion of the reverb, for instance, go for 5 seconds. Or you can cut that down to 0.2, which would be 200 milliseconds. You can have the bass cut out very quickly if you want as well. You can zone in on certain frequencies that you'd like to have ring a little longer, or you'd like to have them ring a little less, and you could pull it down. Another cool feature about this I've noticed with some multibands, you know, when you get up to the next band, it starts pushing that other band. That doesn't happen here. That other band keeps its place. Instead, what happens is that the splits intelligently switch. So you actually won't lose settings if you set one band very carefully. I like that feature. That's very clever. Over here you have your contour settings for the bass and treble. This is your standard reverb contour setting. Also has multipliers and cutoff frequencies, and also a high-end roll-off in the case of treble with the slope. In the case of the bass, you've got your multiply and frequency, and also a dampen, but the dampen can be decreased or increased for further length. Having these contours here are great because it enables you to control the bass and the treble, and then you can use the multiband for all kinds of further tweaking. That's an enormous amount of flexibility. Also, it should be mentioned that this section does sound a bit different from the multiband because these filters are contained within the feedback network. And that means that if you have a cutoff frequency set, that's going to move over time as things feedback throughout the reverb. Whereas over here, the frequencies tend to stay in place. So a slight difference in behavior there. So there's a rundown of the controls. I know there's quite a few, but let's listen to some sounds, hear how this reverb behaves. I've got it set for dry right now. We're going to run some click sounds through it. The first sound is from the Reaper metronome. Second one's the classic URAI standard click sound. And let's just hear the reverb tail by itself. We've got it set all the way over here to reverb. There's no reflections. Of course, you can increase the reverb time significantly. And you can set the reverb time very, very long. Let's listen to that. We'll get back to that reverb in a bit, but let's hear the reflections by themselves. Right now the reflections are set for very tight pattern, position 1A, and it's also very damped. Let's increase that to 2. And we'll make them a bit more lively. Let's go 2J. That's for the room algorithm. You can can listen to the different algorithms. Hall, church, garage, stadium. Stadium's really cool. It can get pretty rhythmic, as I said before. Let's increase the pattern. Let's go back to room and make the pattern really big. Position 4, bright as possible. Now we can further increase that with the spacing control here. Let's just run a click. I tighten it up. Increase the spacing. Stereo width, I can go to mono. Expand it out to 150. Sounds pretty good at 100. Can roll off the high end. Increase the slope to cut out even more high. We can, let's do the stadium, go as big as possible. Tighten it up. So when those blend into the reverb, you're going to get some characteristic sounds. Let's get a little bit more reasonable with this and bring in some reverb. That's the stadium. Roll off some of that top. And let's do the room. Let's change the pattern and hear how that changes the overall character of the verb. You can actually start to get some almost non-lin kind of effects from this. And I believe that we're hearing it now without any of the diffusion or any of the chorus, so that is just the raw pattern of the reflections and reverb. So let's look at the density and diffusion controls and hear what they do. As you can see here, I've got it set all the way to reverb, so we're only going to hear the reverb part. And in fact, I'm going to raise this roll-off all the way up, so you can hear all that top end and how the density and diffusion affects it. We've got a time of 1.59 seconds. That should be pretty good. No pre-delay. We're going to run the click. We've got density all the way down, diffusion all the way down. The diffusion size is off. And we've got the chorus as disabled as we can get it. So let's really hear what that density knob does. I've got the reverb set up now for the most granular, specular sound that I could come up with. And by that I mean you can hear each individual reflection of the reverb discreetly. And then I'm going to turn the density knob up and we'll hear what happens. As I'm sure you heard, it got smoother. And not only did it get smoother, there was a little bit more time before that reverb developed, a little bit of a whoosh, as it were, that density kind of making the reverb take a little bit longer to develop. Let's listen one more time for that. I'm sure you heard the smoothness of the specularity. Now listen for the difference in the timing, you might hear a little bit of a gap before that density builds up. It helps give the impression of a longer room. It's not pre-delay per se, but it does have a similar effect in that reverb's just a little bit behind in time. It's just a little bit of extra time between that hit and when you're perceiving a swell of the reverb. Right, so let's do the diffusion. Let's go back down here. Now, I believe you do have to give it a diffusion size before it will do anything. Let's verify that right now, actually. Yeah, no change. Let's give it a size. Now let's put up the diffusion. Smoothing out. Let's increase the size. Smoother. Let's give it even bigger size. Let's hear it without the diffusion. Should be very audible that the reverb's a lot smoother now. And let's add in some of that density. So hopefully that gives you a clearer idea of what these controls are going to do. I'll mention one other thing really quickly is that you can get these pitchy artifacts if you're moving some of these controls in real time. So let's check that out. So that's something to be aware of, maybe something that you could possibly exploit as a creative effect. Not all of the knobs will sound great as you turn them in real time. Sometimes you can hear artifacts, but they'll go away as soon as you've settled on a setting. Let's move over to the reflections. Let's turn this over to early reflections. And if you remember here, this button will switch those diffusion controls to the early reflections. Let's check out the reflections and what the diffusion does to the reflections. Let's give it a size. Let's increase the size. Smoother. A little bit grainy, actually. Interesting. So when you set the diffusion and you set the reflections exactly the way that you want to play around with that size. There are going to be points along this dial here that really focus in and make sense to you. If you're looking for something smooth, you can find points along this dial that are going to sound smoother than others. And if you want it really grainy, you may want to not use it. Or in fact, you can get some graininess when it's way up high. We'll explore that as well. No size. Pretty smooth. Smooth. Well, you can hear this other type of granularity creeping in there. Let's crank it up. So let's go and just construct a sound from scratch here. Here's the room. Let's make it farther away. That seems to work. We've got only reflections going on right now. Let's roll off some of the reflections a little bit. Maybe make them a bit more absorbent, a bit more damped. Pretty good. Now let's smooth them out in the Advanced tab with the Diffusion and the Diffusion sides. Remember this knob? Reflections is what we want. Let's keep some of that specularity there. That's pretty good. Start mixing in the reverb. Let's have a listen to this reverb actually. Reverb is very specular, so let's go over here. So we're adjusting the reverb. Let's start with the density. Sounded pretty good. Let's blend the two together. Here what we've got. Bringing in the early reflections. So that'll be your diffusion settings. Let's take a closer look at those coarse settings with a different sound where we can hear more about what's going on. So let's hear the dry sound before we bring in the reverb, which is set to a very long decay time. So a little bit of pitch modulation already in that sound. I don't think it's going to be enough to throw us off. Let's bring in the reverb. So a little bit of motion going on in there, but we can obviously increase that significantly. Let's add some modulation with the coarse. If it's set to static, those other two buttons won't light up. You do have to give it a rate, and then these buttons will light up and you'll get your coarse. Let it set it for enrich, which is the subtlest of the three different settings. Let's hear the difference. A little bit of a shimmer. Let's move it to drift, where you're going to hear more of the pitches changing. You hear a lot more wiggle there on the pitch. And as it gets more as the tail goes on. So we'll go into detune mode, but we're going to give it quite a bit of coarse actually. Let's max it out. Let's give it a faster rate significantly. Let's put in some of this wander, which again I find to be a subtle control, although I did kind of sense a little bit more complexity to the motion. The manual, I believe, describes it as chunkier. Let's listen to that and really hear what happens to that tail as it gets to the end. Near the end of the tail, it's really kind of disintegrated into almost noise. Now we can go for a bit more normal setting. Let's do the enrich mode. And then I'm going to turn on and off the thick and coarse. Hear that? It just opens up a little bit more dimension to me. Becomes a bit bigger in sound. Without. With. You definitely can hear it in headphones. It's just nicer, I think, depending on what you need. Let's do the dynamics section and play with the compressor a bit. Okay, so I've got the dynamics here on a vocal with a rather large reverb sound. It's set to duck, and it's going to duck both the reflections and the reverb. Watch the gain reduction meter. This is exaggerated, probably more than you would do in the mix, but I do want you to hear the ducking action and how when the vocal stops in between those spaces, that reverb comes rushing up. Always alive, and will always survive. So that would be the ducking. Compression is another animal. It won't have that swoop up, but what it will have is some clamping on the loud parts, so those loud notes may not get overwhelmed by reverb. Always alive, and will always survive. So pretty straightforward, nice feature to have. Let's move to the Fidelity section. This is where the bit crushers are and the filters. For sound, let's go back to the click sounds. Let's do the Reaper click this time. First, let's play with its bandwidth. Can you hear what happens when the... Ooh, you can find some nice resonance in there. So we'll leave that up. Let's play with the bit crusher. Let's just bit crush the main output. Once you get down to like 8-9 bits, you can really hear it just break up there. For vintage emulation, I was finding values around 12 bits to be really nice, where you don't start to hear that static until it gets a lot quieter. There it is. Might even want to go higher than that. Let's raise it a little bit, because you hear it right at the end of the tail. It goes very nice, but you got to watch it, right? Otherwise, you're just getting a deliberate effect and not an emulation of classic gears. So let's try about 13.24. Not bad. Let's try crushing the reverb. Leave the output normal. Just crush the reverb. So there's the reverb crushed. You can hear that the reflections are still fine. but the reverb's nice and gnarly. Let's do the opposite. Let's go full range with the reverb, but crush the reflections. You hear that the reverb's smooth, but the reflections are that's what they sound like normally. In the blend, let's crush both a little bit. Let's bring them down to about 14 maybe. Really nice, and you can get in some classic tones that way. Recirculation has to do with the feedback loop, and you can actually do some bit crushing within the feedback network. Let's hear what that sounds like. Maybe too much. You can, in fact, effectively decrease your reverb time with this if you don't mind the staticky kind of breakup sound. Yeah, it cuts out early. Go even further. This, you never know, it might be useful on percussion sounds and that sort of thing. Now, this depth control over here is another one of the subtle controls. And the manual says it has to do with the quality of the modulation as you go on later into the reverb tail. So it says that you've got a more lively sound when this is up all the way. Presumably as you reduce it, you're going to lose some kind of resolution or some kind of amount of modulation as the reverb tail increases. Let's go back up all the way. Yeah, maybe a bit of a shorter time might be easier to hear the difference there. Let's put it up all the way. And down all the way. Or actually on mod 1 I should put. I think I'm hearing a difference. What does static sound like? And finally, the Equaliser tab. Let's do something very quickly because I think we all know what an equalizer is. Let's move some high shelf up. It's got a good sound to it. Let's cut off even more high end. You can really cut off tons of high end if you set it. Low shelf. Let's give that a whirl. Yeah, not bad. Anyway, Equaliser is right there available for you. And there's some sounds from the different tabs, but now we're going to get into the fun part. We're going to do the Reverb Multiplier, the Multiband Reverb Multiplier. Now for this, let's just do a simple kick drum sound. Let's hear it dry first. Again. And let's bring in the wetness. It's already pretty long. It's set for reverb only right now. And let's dig into the multipliers. Let's say we wanted that low end to ring out a lot, but just around the subs. Let's set this for the subs. Let's increase the reverb time. I guess we're going by 5 times reverb time. That's a lot. Between 0 hertz and 96 hertz. Let's hear what that sounds like. Yeah, it's a lot longer. So we want instead to shorten it up and just take out the sub rumble. We can go to 0.2 times. And hear that low end just magically disappear. So we wanted to take a bit more out into the lower mids. We could do that too, leaving. And you can hear how that's different from EQ. Because it's like the low end's there, then it's gone. If you just EQ'd it, it wouldn't be there ever. But it starts off, you can hear the low end start off and then disappear. Check it out. We'll go a little bit longer with it so you can hear when it. And then make it shorter. And shorter. So very different from EQ. It's very cool. You can do all sorts of stuff. Let's say I wanted to, for whatever reason, get a whole bunch of high-end splash on it. And let's drag that up. Let's say about 4 kilohertz and up, maybe. 3.5. Here we go. The kettle's on. Or let's say I wanted to dampen the high end. And again, you can hear how it starts off. That top end's in there, it starts off, and then it dies off quick. Let's make it really short. Hear that? And that's different from just equalizing it, because let's just put a filter on it and hear that. In this case, the high end was never there, right? It's much more static. Of course, we'll get to here, you could set this and get some dynamic motion out of it, but let's pull this down again. And let's even dig lower into the spectrum. You just hear it at the top end is going to start off and then disappear. So very cool. Another thing, let's say that you're in a mix and you just want to have, I don't know, some upper mids, say between 2-5 kilohertz. You just want to ring them out a little more. But overall, you don't want a long reverb time. You just want a little splash, a little ring. You can tune that splash, make it higher, lower, shorter, longer. Very cool. You could use it to reduce rings, overtones that you don't want, say in a drum or any kind of performance. Kind of scoop out the sound without actually scooping out the sound, just the reverb around it. Amazing what you can do with it. So let's try the contour section. Let's give it a longer reverb time. Let's just increase the bass. See if we can get it to go really long. Let's do something kind of dumb. We'll move this up, 2.5. Let's further increase the dampen. Oh, here it come up. That rumble there. Some reverbs this would eventually end up feeding back. It would get louder and louder, it would build up. You'd have to hit the emergency eject button. Seems like they've taken care of that here. Very cool. That had gone for a long, long time. Let's try it the other way. Let's dampen it out. Let's just get rid of all the lows. That's kind of cool because you do hear the low from the dry signal popping through now. Really a matter of what you want to do. You can be as creative as you want with this, or as practical. You can, say, decrease the top end off the reverb altogether. Or just take it off the very fizzy top. As opposed to that. Or you could just do the static roll-off at the end here too as well. So very cool. And between these two, to be able to have both the contours and the multiband is pretty incredible. So let's check out under the settings menu here, reflection timing. Here you can see include pre-delay is checked, and that means that reflections will be subject to the pre-delay. So let's go into our reverb. We've got 500 milliseconds pre-delay. We've got the reflections and reverb both audible. We're going to play a single click. So what we should hear is the click, then 500 milliseconds, then both the reflections and the reverb together after 500 milliseconds. And that's exactly what we heard. Let's go back up and let's switch that around to not include pre-delay on the reflection timing. And what this should do is have the reflections happen right after the click, then the 500 millisecond wait, and then the reverb only. Listen again. And there it is. So that's what that control does. So one more final quick thing to test out here is this drop-down menu. If you remember that you could set the reflections to either follow the reverb course or disable them altogether, or give them their own low, medium, or high setting independent of what the reverb's doing. Let's set that for disabled. And I did find it to be very subtle depending on what was fed into it. So I actually ran a tone generator here set to 220 hertz, not 440 or 1 kilohertz, because that's just nicer to listen to. Here it is dry. Now we're going to set this all the way to early reflections. I'm going to start to bring them in. You'll hear them come up. Now we're all early reflections here. Those early reflections are set to medium, large spacing, basic room. Not hearing any modulation though. Maybe a little panning from the phase cancellations of the different taps, but not any modulation. What happens when we go to medium? Ah, nothing. And why is that? Because this modulation section hasn't been engaged yet. You do need to have a little bit of mod rate. Gonna get a bit of artifact, but that's no problem. And now you can hear it start to move around. And note that it's moving around even though the course still says disabled and the wander says disabled. So there still is some modulation going on as soon as you send it there. I'm not sure if that makes a difference. Let's turn in some chorus here. Turn up some chorus. Let's go for the detune. So now we have set the chorus onto the early reflections. Let's go up to high. Rather, we've set the early reflections into a chorus. Let's put high. And that did increase a bit. Let's have it follow the settings for the reverb. And there you go. That is what that does. We can disable it again. Yeah, we'll get rid of that tone. So there's some tweaking about how to change the sound, what does what. Good starting point anyway. Let's hear some more presets that I came up with and some more examples of the plugin in action. Tai Chi by Reverb Foundry. What can I say? It is a beast. Sounds like a beast, and it plays like one. So many controls, but it is really actually pretty easy to get a grips with it. The manual is like 14 pages long. Actually not too much, and you find yourself operating this very quickly in no time at all. This plugin's still on introductory offer at half price, I believe, until December the 20th. Also, if you go to the Reverb Foundry site, you'll see the fantastic HD cart reverb plugin there, as well as the M7 software controller. I think that's a fantastic deal for some top-end sound. Reverb Foundry certainly know what they're doing, and I hope you agree. I hope you enjoyed this. I hope that this was helpful. Make sure you like, make sure you subscribe, and we'll see you next time on Obsessive Audio.